Welcome to another edition of Silicon Bytes, the third video in this format. And it's been an incredibly packed week with news. It's impossible to cover everything with changes on the ground, on the front line. That's not what this format is about anyway. We want to dive into some of the stories that you may not have heard of. And of course, this is the episode which I think a lot of people will be tuning in for. We're going to take a deep dive into the phenomenon of NAFO and the dog memes. So let's jump straight in. The first story this week is from the Moscow Times. Russia places leading Buryat activist on wanted list. The Russian authorities have placed Alexandra Garmazhapova, the head of the Free Buryatia Foundation, on its wanted list, independent news website Media Zona reported Friday, citing the activist herself. So this is quite an interesting story. There's not a huge amount of detail about it, but I think it does talk to the paranoia that is now building up that through Putin's actions, through his destructive war and his use of ethnic minorities, nationalities within Russia as cannon fodder, that he may be building up huge stresses within the system, forcing some kind of fragmentation of Russia, which, of course, many people would wish that to happen. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually likely, but this does suggest that perhaps the Siloviki are getting a bit paranoid about the Russian regions and clamping down on activists. Another story that is war-related, and again, it reeks of paranoia as well. Amid Ukraine war, the Kremlin orders a nationwide bomb shelter overhaul. So Russian bomb shelters all over the country are undergoing systematic inspections and repairs following a Kremlin order to upgrade the country's crumbling Soviet-era infrastructure. And for somebody who a long time ago did some urban exploring, where I actually explored the tunnels under MGU, which is the huge university in Moscow, I can say that there is a huge network of these bomb shelters, nuclear-era bomb shelters in Russia. Many of the ones I saw hadn't had any maintenance for decades. And the one under MGU seemed to have fallen into some kind of disrepair shortly after it was completed in the 1950s or 60s, I would guess. So that is a big job. The next story is another incredibly telling one, I think. And again, out of these three, they're all from the Moscow Times, and this is the third and final one from that paper that we're going to look at. And it says Russia weighs wartime tax increase. Now, this is a very small story, but I think it has really big implications. There's been a lot of questions through the year as to why oil sanctions aren't working, as to why Western sanctions aren't hitting the Russian economy, why it didn't collapse like a house of cards, why there still seems to be goods in shops, and there isn't widespread discontent. Well, it's clear that the sanctions do have a very delayed effect, and some of those effects may not be felt for years and decades. So some of the implications are felt very quickly, like on the automotive industry and the aviation industry. Other industries such as food packaging manufacture may not have been hit nearly so hard. But the fact that the Russian government is seeking to raise taxes on business at a time like this, the reporting here suggests by a 0.5 percentage points, which isn't huge, but that could be the thin end of the wedge. Now, cruelty, war crimes, conscription, none of these things have brought Russians out onto the streets in any great numbers. Will, however, pressure on the economy, will pressure moving from those who are poor and essentially have little influence in society, very little to lose. Now that pressure perhaps is going to start being placed on people who actually have something to lose and taxing their businesses. Maybe that will trigger the long-awaited resistance to Putin's war. Now, I'm going to try and have a spread of other publications this week. So we've got a story here from The Guardian. Large-scale Russian missile attacks are apparently reconnaissance for a future offensive. Now, if you've been observing the news, especially Russian opposition sources and Ukrainian sources, you'll see that many believe that offensive has already begun, but that the Russians have not moved very far in the couple of days since many thousands of ill-equipped conscripts have been sort of thrown against the Ukrainian front line with very little gains to claim for that. As with previous missile strikes, Ukraine reportedly shot 61 out of 70 of the cruise missiles down, many of them launched from the Black Sea area. And some of you will have seen reports that some of those missiles overflew Moldova, which wasn't declared a threat to NATO. Nonetheless, it must be a concern. Now, this offensive, we talked about this a week ago, and it does seem now to be unfolding, and that's because Western armor, especially American Bradleys and so on, have started arriving in Europe. Russia must want to get some sort of tactical advantage in before the ammunition, the heavy armor, the extra clout arrives. And remember as well, there are tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers training in the West, especially in Britain, with a multinational training force. Those troops are going to start hitting the front. They're going to be fresh, full of energy, full of confidence as well, because that's another aspect of the training that tries to instill sort of confidence and optimism into people, rather than the sort of pessimism and fear, which is the hallmark of the way Russia manages its troops. And another story that many of you, especially the NAFO community, will be watching very keenly, and that is the Muscovite. That is Elon Musk's continued comments, one could even call it meddling, in the war. And the story here is that, again from the Guardian, is that there is fury in Ukraine as Elon Musk's SpaceX limits the use of Starlink satellite system to control Ukrainian drones. Musk is quoted as saying that the SpaceX satellite communication system was never intended to be weaponized. However, this objection has not been brought up over the previous 9 months or so that system has been used for that self-same purpose. It's an extraordinary coincidence that he should release this policy, that he should try to limit the use of this equipment at exactly the same time as Russia launches its offensive. Call me suspicious and paranoid, but I don't believe in accidents. I don't believe in coincidences. And again, from The Guardian, another story which is causing considerable worry is the situation in Moldova. And since I printed this story out over the weekend, there have been further developments and further announcements, and that is the resignation of the Moldovan PM and the EU-inclined government. And they blame the crisis caused by Russian aggression. Now, Moldova has been under huge pressure. It is Europe's poorest country, and it has now a huge refugee community from Ukraine, which they have opened their arms, opened their cities to let them in, and they have done an incredible work there. But clearly it has put strain on not just the economy, but on the political system as well. Pro-Western Natalia Gavrilita quits as Russian ambassador summoned over apparent violation of airspace. So that is the missile story, and that has added to the pressures there. But during that news conference, Natalia also announced that the time had come for her resignation, adding that no one could have expected her government to manage so many crises caused by Russian aggression. Well, this, I think, is a story on many levels. One of those levels is, why isn't Europe providing much more support to Moldova to mitigate the huge pressure on its system and economy? The deeper story, however, is what is going on behind the scenes. And there are reports that Russia has potentially a lot of agents and assets. And as it's trying to stir stuff up in Serbia to take eyes off what it's doing in Ukraine, it seems to be trying to pull the same trick on Moldova. So watch this space. There are rumors that this instability in the politics of Moldova could potentially be used by some kind of false flag operation by Russia. We know since the start of the invasion that Moldova, because it's not in NATO, was a potential target for Russian aggression. So this is extremely worrying. Now, the last story from The Guardian is quite a curious one here, and it is the historian Lawrence Rees. He is well known for having written a very authoritative book called Hitler and Stalin, the Tyrants and the Second World War. That, of course, would only be of passing interest, perhaps, in current times, but apparently President Zelensky has been reading that book, much to the, I can see it, sort of pleasure of this historian there. Not just reading it cover to cover, but actually dipping in and reading it every day. And it's interesting to hear what Lawrence says about that. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, of course, was in London. And for those who watched his speech to Parliament last Wednesday, it was absolutely stuffed with references to the Second World War and to Winston Churchill. He states, just as evil was defeated before, so evil will be defeated today. Now, comparisons between the Second World War, between Churchill's strong stand against fascism and Volodymyr Zelensky, of course, those are incredibly sort of positive and uplifting sentiments, both for the government of Ukraine and for the people as well. But I think there's more to it than this, and the historian sort of unpacks that. Out of the two leaders, Zelensky and Putin, we have to ask which one of those is actually learning the lessons of the Second World War and which one is repeating the mistakes of that war. I think the answer is very clear there. And Lawrence Rees goes on to suggest that Putin should perhaps read a little bit more of the, a little bit more history, a little less of the mythologized, propagandistic Russian history. In fact, of course, we hope he doesn't read any books. We hope he doesn't learn the lessons of the Second World War, because it's the same kind of mistakes that Putin is making that Hitler made that really undermines their performance in the war, especially the micromanagement, the terror, and this other tactic as well of setting your subordinates against each other because it stops them from attacking you. We see that same behavior with Putin, with Gerasimov and Prigozhin, almost locked in sort of continuous spat, fighting over resources, fighting over their role in the war. Now, the last story we're going to look at in that vein is taken from The Economist. We've got two stories here. One is Russian technocrats keep funds flowing for Vladimir Putin's war. The economy is slowly being repurposed. Now, this is very interesting because this same narrative has appeared in a couple of excellent interviews on Times Radio over the weekend. First of all, if we're going to judge criminality in this war, everyone focuses on the propagandists. They focus on Prigozhin, the Wagnerites, etc. But behind the scenes, Russia has an extraordinary talented set of economists who've been able to keep the economy together, stop it collapsing, stop the currency completely collapsing, and they've been able to keep Vladimir Putin's war machine working. And that is despite the most intense sanctions in history. So the question has to be asked, are these people also culpable for the horror that is unfolding in Ukraine? I would argue that they are. They are a key mechanism in Putin's war machine, and they should be considered culpable in the same way as his lieutenants are. And of course, this aspect of the story that is terrifying is that the Russian economy is being slowly repurposed. It's being geared up for total war, for war output, munitions output, and to repair the smashed vehicles, and potentially, although there's not much evidence of it, potentially to create sort of uniforms and equipment for troops at the front line. It seems that Europe and the US, according to Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, the West has not geared up in quite the same way. We're moving at a much slower pace in retooling our economies to counter the threat from Russia. And that, of course, will have to change if Ukraine is to be victorious. And then the last story here, why the West oil sanctions on Russia are proving to be underwhelming. As another oil embargo comes into force on February the 5th, The Economist advises us to manage our expectations. And I draw your attention to this story because an interview just published on the channel with Anastasia Shabochkina goes into incredible detail about the sanctions regime and how Russia is able to break that and get the money that it needs to keep its war machine going. Well, now is the bit, as advertised, the NAFO special edition. The details in this report have been pulled from a number of sources. We'll put links to those in the description but I'm very grateful to the Kiev Post, to Sky News, to DW, Emerging Europe, and the Brookings Institute for their recent articles on meme warfare and the NAFO phenomenon. Well, let's jump into it. So what is NAFO? Well, it's a meme-driven community that has risen to become an incredibly formidable force in the fight against Russian propaganda. It was originally created by someone from Poland, Kamil Zelenskiy. He was the first fella, as they're called, and in fact, the first fella was forged on May the 19th, and NAFO was created on May the 24th. This used to be a one-man operation, but fast forward 9 months later, and the process now involves 100-odd digital designers and developers who are creating these dog icons for the NAFO virtual army. Let's unpack some of the details. They're dubbed the North Atlantic Fellows Organization, NAFO, and it is a decentralized community that was born out of a viral internet meme and social media movement. And it was forged not in the first days of the war, because I think everyone was really focused at that point on just survival. But as it became clear that Ukraine was not going to be overwhelmed, that it actually had the potential to push Russia back, then the focus really became on supporting that effort materially and in terms of morale. Now, NAFO means different things to different people. Some treat it to help others, some use it to fight disinformation, while for others, it's a place to find solace from all the horrors that are happening. And it can feel sort of quite depressing when you don't have much agency. You're not in Ukraine. You can't necessarily join the army. That may not be where your talents best lie. Everyone, however, wants to feel they're doing something. And this is one of the first wars in history where information has been a significant component in offensive operations, which Russia has deployed. So in fact, NAFO is a great way for people to get involved and to quash the aggressive disinformation that is emanating from Russia. And before we go on, I should make an omission here. I do have a NAFO avatar. I am on Twitter, and I do, in the terms of the NAFO community, bonk Vatniks. We'll come on to that in a minute. That phrase has a very different meaning in the UK, so it's a little difficult to pronounce that. But yeah, my UK fellas will understand what I mean by that. By design, the organization is nearly impossible to shut down. It lacks a centralized structure that can be targeted, and as a result, NAFO has become a crucial player in the ongoing battle to fight Russia's efforts to spread misinformation while trying to fundraise and bring awareness of the war to people abroad. Memes have become a staple of this war in Ukraine, providing a valuable window into key questions about how actors use memes for political warfare. And I think this is the crucial thing here, is to ask, who is the audience? What's the message? Who is driving the production of these memes? It has to be said that despite the joke that this all comes out of Langley, Virginia, and it's all run by the CIA, which I think some of the Russian trolls believe, it is completely decentralized. There is no control. There is really no editorial, and there's no sort of style guide to how to produce these. What you have is an organic community trading ideas, trading techniques that work, and supporting each other. In that sense, it could only have come about through the internet. It also has to be said that when you're in this community, you feel like it is extraordinarily active. But if you go and look at some of the stats around it, it's clear that the use of memes surged at the start of the war and the first months of the war, but as a kind of fatigue in the general population has come about, the trends suggest that the meme campaign has actually decreased over time. And what you're left with is hardcore of activists, potentially sharing a lot more amongst themselves, but the consumption of these memes goes down in the population at large. Many people want to just switch off from this horror and live their lives and not think about it. So one of the missions of NAFO is to prick people's consciences and make sure that that does not happen. And one of the key tools they use is humor. Many of the memes are funny. Some are incredibly vicious. Some can be quite unpleasant as well, but they are never boring. And when you compare that to the memes coming out of the other side, the Vatnik side, those who support Russian disinformation, they tend to be very crudely put together, unfunny. That's obviously a question of perspective, perhaps, but they don't seem to have that sort of organic strength behind them, and they certainly don't have moral strength behind them, which, in my mind, humor comes from a place of truth. So if you're trying to produce memes from a place of lies, it's not going to be nearly as effective. NAFO's decentralized group on Twitter made a major impact early on the war by taking down Russia's top diplomat in Vienna, Mikhail Ulyanov, for spreading disinformation. He reacted in a fit of anger, and Ulyanov responded to a NAFO tweet with the now infamous phrase, "You pronounce this nonsense, not me." That blunder, of course, has turned him into an internet joke, and it gave NAFO its first viral catchphrase. There have been many since. That same Russian ambassador, who's been a treasure trove of nonsense himself, published another article shortly after that in Russia Today and Sputnik. One Russian official, in response to that article, referred to NAFO as brain-damaged dogs. So there you have another meme that has been doing the rounds. And that is one of the beautiful aspects of this movement, is that they can absorb the crude and sometimes illiterate criticism made of it by its detractors, and it can turn that around into humor. In September 2022, RT even tried to discredit NAFO by claiming it was a pro-Ukrainian bot army. But the truth is clear. NAFO is a powerful source for truth and justice, feared and hated by those who seek to spread misinformation and sow discord. What always seems to work is ridicule. Russian propagandists see themselves as incredibly serious and important. That's why they hate being made fun of. And it really doesn't work against NAFO, because it's an organization that makes fun of itself. The very character used in the avatars, a horde of cartoon Shiba Inu dogs, is itself quite self-mocking. And the adoption of these symbols by many in the Ukrainian army, they even graphic some of their vehicles with these cartoon dogs, also means there's a certain self-mocking aspect that the Ukrainian army has. And I think that is also a strength, not taking itself massively seriously and also trying to boost morale through humor. But beyond the jokes and memes, the fellas, as they're called, have raised huge sums to buy ammunition and vehicles for Ukrainian resistance. They've also supported the Georgian Legion, a very strong military contingent from Georgia. They've also done fundraising for drones and winter equipment and many other aspects of the war that help Ukrainian resistance. NAFO boasts a diverse community of over 80,000 members who come together in a fluid network of loosely collected nodes. Division could be avoided if there was a leadership structure in NAFO, and if NAFO had a kind of specific direction or even a committee to govern it. But as its founders states, NAFO has no specific direction, no specific purpose, except to push back on the lies and aggression of the Russian side and its agents, assets, and useful idiots. Moreover, you cannot organize that many people and align them to a single set of goals. That does mean that, like a rabid pack of dogs, NAFO has at times not just attacked the enemy, but individual members have turned on each other. There have been instances where they've even got into spats with Ukrainians as well, which to my mind is completely unacceptable. But again, it's a community of individuals, thousands and thousands of individuals, all pushing in different directions like molecules of gas in a container. However, they're united in a singular purpose, and that is to support Ukrainian survival, resistance, and victory. Pete, who prefers not to give his name, helps run The Forge. The Forge is a group of around 100 people working around the clock to make the Shiba Inu avatars, or fellas as they're called. To get one, you have to donate to the Georgian Legion, which means you have to donate to the war effort, and it is a good cause, of course. Twitter users then post screenshots of those donations along with a fella request. They can define what they want their fella to be wearing, any items they wanted to be holding, and the general sort of characteristics of their avatar character. And most people get exactly what they want. A few people have made a subsequent donation and changed their avatars over through the course of the year. The frequency and popularity of the memes have also corresponded to the major ebbs and flows in the Ukrainian war, and of course with spikes in meme production that relate to major offensives and battles. More specifically, memes seem to play a supporting role that are designed to amplify the tactical effects on the battlefield. Now, that, of course, isn't by intention. It's an organic process. And I think it's absolutely critical to say that this is a reactive process. The memes do not appear prior to events. They're not orchestrated by the Ukrainian government or the CIA or anybody else. Those memes are extremely reactive to what's actually happening on the front or in the propagandistic sphere. But they also react very, very quickly. So within minutes, not even hours, but within minutes sometimes of things taking place, you will start to see some very cleverly crafted memes already appearing. Despite this appearance that the West has gained the upper hand in the ongoing information war against Russia, it's not always been the case. In fact, for many years, and really from 2014 through to the full-scale war, Russia seemed to be effectively controlling the information and turning the narrative in its favor, and effectively using the hybrid informational warfare strategy, disseminating disinformation, disseminating false, misleading information that's designed to sow confusion, discord, distrust, and ultimately to convince people not to take action and not to apportion blame. We saw this very effectively after Crimea and the Little Green Men. We even saw it in this narrative that somehow the invasion of Donbass was a civil war. We saw it in the Russian narrative that Russian speakers were being persecuted in Donbass, which they were not. And we saw it in the horrific narratives put out when the airliner MH17 was shot down, that somehow that had nothing to do with Russia itself. By publishing false stories, manipulating social media, and using state-controlled media outlets such as RT, formerly known as Russia Today, fortunately now banned from the UK, they spread propaganda and lies at an alarming rate. In fact, research from MIT suggested that fake news on Twitter spreads 6 times faster than truthful information. But it's clear that Russia understands the power of fake news, and it also understands the power of the algorithms that are hungry to propagate these more popular materials, whether they're true or false. And they've been able to use that as a powerful tool to achieve their strategic goals. As in a famous quote attributed to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth has even put its trousers on. One of the early adopters of the NAFO avatar was Ivana Stradna, advisor to the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and writer for the Kiev Post newspaper. For many years, she says, Russia has been waging a serious information war globally. This information war imbalance, which existed until May of last year, has now been corrected to an extent by the NAFO movement. When one member is threatened, or in the case of the fellas, spot some Russian propaganda on Twitter, they can tweet Article 5, and other NAFO fellas will come to their aid. Instead of debunking Russian claims, NAFO launches memes against Russian diplomats that are so absurd they cannot really counter that and respond, says Ivana. This is where I think NAFO is doing quite a marvelous job. The fellows stress that NAFO expansion is non-negotiable. And with hundreds of fellow requests coming in on any given day, it looks like there is no force on earth that can stop this movement. As one of the members of NAFO stresses, they really appreciate the fact that someone is standing up to Russian bullies and propagandists online. And in addition, NAFO attracts a talented pool of people that make memes and videos that help bring attention to the war. Of course, the information war is not the only aspect of this struggle. There are tens of thousands of Ukrainians fighting on the front lines, suffering and dying. for the freedom of their country. And with only 3% of Russians actually using Twitter, which is the main platform for NAFO, the movement's ultimate success will depend on raising its profile across other social media networks like Facebook and Telegram. Of course, one of the big strengths of NAFO is not that it's targeting Russians, but it's targeting the object of Russian disinformation, which is people around the world, whether it be in Africa, the global south, India, Europe, and America. Despite NAFO's remarkable rise, the focus really should remain on the Ukrainian people who are defending all of Europe against Russian aggression and imperialism. Countries around the world must provide Ukraine with everything it needs to win, including modern tanks and jets. And NAFO plays an important role in raising awareness of those needs, as well as battling Russian propaganda and weaponized disinformation online. And finally, let's lift the covers on Clown World, that toxic environment of Russian state TV propagandists. This week, I'm going to dive into a couple of stories here very quickly, courtesy of Russian Media Monitor. If you haven't subscribed to this on Twitter or YouTube or checked out their website, I definitely recommend that. The team at Russian Media Monitor do an extraordinary job at translating the toxic output of Russia's propagandists. Yet again, a state media member claims that Ukraine has to be eliminated. This comes off the back of statements made by that same individual that Ukraine isn't a thing, that it doesn't exist. If that's the case, then why does it need to be eliminated? Margarita Simonyan is also getting very upset that Russia doesn't have many friends around the world. And those friends that it does have, let's face it, aren't particularly pleasant, like the Iranian regime and North Korea. And the story that really caught my attention this week comes from probably one of the most toxic of the propagandists, the chief sociopath, Vladimir Solovyov, and his program Holy Contact. So three things seem to have driven him mad this week. One is Zelenskyy's trip to London, which have pressed all of his buttons, and the fact that Zelenskyy is greeted as a statesman and clearly has gravitas and authority. That's driven him into an absolute fervor. The other thing he's absolutely lost his mind about is his subordinates, his support on the channel, not live streaming it, making all sorts of technical errors. He absolutely loses his mind and screams at them live on air. And another story, which perhaps hasn't yet been reflected in any of his output, but he's bound to, is the announcement that his son is working as a model in London. Now, that is absolutely extraordinary, and I hope it gets followed up on. There is absolutely no way that the genocide denier-in-chief should have members of his family benefiting from luxury and lifestyles in the West while he incites a genocidal war against Russia's neighbors. And that, frankly, is all I can take of Clown World for this week. Next week, we will review the news once again, and I'm sure it will be absolutely packed with new insights and information. And the special segment will be a dive into the world of Soviet samizdat literature. So watch this space, that episode appearing exactly a week from now.